pummel.
My mother's voice didn't sound human. It sounded like a serrated blade. Then came my father's roar. "Get out, Cora! Get out, you piece of trash!" As our bags hit the frozen dirt like discarded bones. They thought they were throwing away a failure. They didn't realize they were evicting their own savior. I didn't cry. I didn't beg. I just counted the seconds until their world turned to ash. I can still feel the phantom sting of that slap, a physical receipt for 30 years of silent endurance. But before the sirens, before the eviction notice hit their door, and before I reclaimed my crown, there was only the ice. A lethal, blinding Chicago winter that seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the first drop of blood to hit the snow. The Chicago wind doesn't just blow, it screams. It's a jagged, icy blade that cuts through wool and denim until it finds the bone. As I stepped off the curb in Evanston, shielding Alara from the swirling white abyss of the blizzard, the sheer weight of the Andrews estate loomed over us like a mausoleum. My hands were so numb I could barely feel the worn handles of our duffels, but I squeezed them tighter. This wasn't just a holiday visit. It was a test, a final, silent question I was asking a family that had spent a decade trying to forget I existed. I reached the massive oak door, the iron knocker cold enough to sear skin. I didn't have a key. I hadn't had one since the day I told them I was keeping Alara. I knocked, the sound swallowed instantly by the howl of the storm. When the door finally creaked open, there was no warmth, no scent of pine or baking cookies drifting out to greet us. There was only Myra, my mother, standing tall in a silk blouse that cost more than my supposed monthly salary. She didn't look at my face. She looked at the snow melting on the hardwood floor. "Use the kitchen entrance, Cora," she said, her voice a flat, clinical drone. "The foyer has just been polished for the guests." She didn't offer to take Alara's coat. She didn't offer a hug. She simply turned her back and walked away, pointing toward the servants' corridor. I stood there for a heartbeat, the frost on my eyelashes blurring the sight of the grand parlor. Through the archway, I could see my older siblings, Sable and Avon, lounging by a roaring fire. They were laughing, clinking crystal flutes of vintage champagne, surrounded by the opulence I had spent the last 3 years secretly subsidizing. It is a strange, hollow thing to realize that your worth in your own home isn't defined by the blood in your veins, but by the seat they refuse to give you at the table. I looked down at Alara, whose small hand was trembling in mine, and I reminded myself, dignity isn't a gift granted by others. It is the anchor we cast within our own souls when the world tries to drift us away. "Is Grandma mad at us?" Alara whispered, her voice tiny against the distant hum of festive music. "No, sweetheart," I lied, kneeling to brush the snow from her curls. "She's just busy. We're going to be very quiet and very kind, okay? That's our superpower." As we made our way through the kitchen, the scent of roasting turkey felt like an insult. I caught Sable's reflection in a polished silver tray as she strutted into the room. She looked at my simple sweater and boots with a pity so sharp it felt like a physical sting. "Oh, Cora," Sable sighed, swirling her drink. "I suppose we should thank Mom for her charity. It must be so difficult, living on those little tech support checks in that tiny apartment. It's a bit unremarkable, isn't it? The way you've turned out." I met her gaze, my expression as unreadable as a line of code. "Success has many definitions, Sable. I'm quite content with mine." "Contentment is what people settle for when they lack ambition." She shot back, her smile not reaching her eyes. She spoke as if my presence were a stain on the rug, a temporary inconvenience allowed only by the grace of parents who valued appearances above all else. I didn't argue. There is no profit in shouting at a wall that thinks it's a masterpiece. Before I could settle Alara in a corner, Lyle, my father, appeared in the doorway. He didn't invite me into the warmth. He gestured toward his study, a room filled with first edition books and the lingering scent of expensive tobacco. The atmosphere inside was suffocating, the air thick with the pressure of a man who measured his life in ledgers and legacies. He sat behind his mahogany desk and didn't look up as I entered. Instead, he slid a single, crisp sheet of paper across the desk. It was a formal renunciation of inheritance. "Sign it," Lyle commanded, his voice like grinding gravel. "Consider it the cover charge for your seat tonight. I won't have a failure dragging down the Andrews name once I'm gone. I'm protecting what's left of our dignity from your poor choices." He spoke of my failure while sitting in a room kept warm by funds laundered through my shell companies. He spoke of protecting a legacy that had been insolvent since the 2008 crash, saved only by the anonymous intervention of the daughter he was currently disowning. I picked up the pen. My hand didn't shake. To Lyle, this paper was a weapon. To me, it was a release. I signed it with the precision of a surgeon, knowing that real power doesn't need a signature on a dying man's decree. Real power is knowing you own the building while the man inside thinks he owns the room. There, I said softly, sliding the paper back. I hope it brings you the peace you think you're buying. Lyle finally looked at me, but there was no recognition of a daughter in his eyes. Only the cold satisfaction of a transaction completed. I looked at him and felt a sudden sharp pang of pity. The strongest people are often those who can walk away from what they never truly needed. He was so terrified of losing his status that he had already lost his soul. He believed I was penniless, a ghost haunting the halls of my childhood. But as I walked out, I felt the silent vibration of my encrypted phone in my pocket. A message from Vera. The Calyx Properties audit is complete. The trap is set. I returned to the kitchen to find Alara helping the staff fold napkins. She was smiling, her small fingers working carefully to match the crisp edges. She looked up and beamed at me, and for a moment, the coldness of the house retreated. I knelt beside her, tucking a loose hair behind her ear. "Ilara, listen to me," I whispered. "The light inside you doesn't depend on whether Grandma or Grandpa turn on the lamp. We are here to be kind, even if they've forgotten how. Do you understand?" "I understand, Mommy," she said, her eyes bright and trusting. Kindness is the light. The moment was shattered by Avon, who stormed in and tossed a heavy stack of technical manuals onto the flour-dusted counter. He didn't look at Alara. He didn't ask how our trip was. "Since you're here on our dime, earn your keep," Avon snapped. "My company's servers are lagging, and I'm not paying an outside firm holiday rates when I have an IT grunt in the family. Fix it before tomorrow morning, or don't expect a ride back to the station." He treated me like an unpaid servant, a convenience to be used and discarded. I looked at the manuals, then at my brother's arrogant, entitled face. He had no idea that I had spent the last 6 months deciding whether or not to let his failing startup go bankrupt. I accepted the manuals without a word. My mind was already navigating the digital architecture of his servers, seeing the vulnerabilities he was too lazy to fix. The weight of the family shadows felt heavier than ever, but beneath that weight, my resolve was hardening into diamond. I checked my watch. The dinner bell rang, a silver, tinny sound that echoed through the hollow house. It was time. As I led Alara toward the dining room, Myra stepped into the doorway, her silk skirt swishing like a warning. She didn't move. She stood there, blocking the path to the main table, her eyes filled with a terrifying, calculated hatred that went beyond mere disappointment. Her hand tightened on the doorframe, her knuckles white, her voice dropping to a sharp whisper that cut deeper than the Chicago frost. "Don't think that signature makes you one of us, Cora," she hissed, staring down at Alara with an icy disdain. "You and that girl are guests of necessity, not love. Remember your place." I stood frozen in the drafty hallway, the cold weight of Myra's words still ringing in my ears. I felt like a trespasser in my own childhood home, a ghost wandering through rooms that had been meticulously scrubbed of my existence. My fingers traced the cold wallpaper, my heart hammering against my ribs. I had come here seeking a bridge, but all I found were cliffs. "Go find the extra silver trays in the pantry, Cora," Myra had snapped earlier, dismissing me like an errant servant. I obeyed, not out of subservience, but to get Alara away from the piercing glares of the parlor. I left my daughter sitting near the fireplace, safely tucked away from the immediate line of fire. But as I retreated toward the shadows of the back hallway, the sound of muffled voices pulled me to a halt. I paused just outside the library door. Myra and Sable were inside, their tones clinical, devoid of the festive warmth they displayed to their guests. "The documentation is nearly ready," Myra said, her voice dropping into that terrifyingly efficient register she used for fixing problems. "Her income is sporadic, and living as a single mother in a city like that is inherently unstable. Illinois family law is quite clear on the best interests of the child." Exactly, Sable chimed in, the clink of ice against her glass punctuating her words. Alara deserves a proper education. A strict boarding school would strip away that bohemian influence Cora provides. It's about the family legacy. We can't have the girl growing up to be another disappointment. My blood ran cold. My knuckles whitened as I gripped the silver tray I was holding. They weren't just judging me. They were plotting a kidnapping under the guise of guardianship. They wanted to take Alara, my heart, my light, to fix a reputation I supposedly tarnished. I closed my eyes, forcing my breath to stay steady. True character isn't revealed in how we treat the powerful, but in how we shield the innocent. I wouldn't scream. I wouldn't burst in. A mother's love is a quiet titanium shield, and I was already forging the counterstrike. I moved back toward the parlor, my face a mask of practiced calm. Through the grand archway I saw Alara. She was sitting perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, politely listening to Avin brag about his latest venture. She looked so small against the towering mahogany bookshelves. I vowed right then that no amount of Andrews's malice would ever pierce the sanctuary I had built for her. "Time for the tree," Lyle announced, his voice booming with a hollow authority that filled the house. The family gathered around the 12-foot fir, a masterpiece of gold tinsel and white lights that looked beautiful but lacked a soul. Lyle began handing out the blessings. He handed Sable a velvet box containing a diamond pendant that caught the light like a predator's eye. Avon received a limited edition watch, its gold casing reflecting the self-congratulatory smirk on his face. The air was thick with the scent of pine and arrogance. Then Myra turned her gaze toward Alara. "And for our little guest," she said, her voice projecting across the room so even the staff could hear. She reached behind a chair and pulled out a tattered, translucent plastic bag. She handed it to Alara. Inside were stained, mismatched clothes and a few plastic toys with jagged, broken edges. Remnants from Sable's attic. "It's vital for children in your specific situation to learn the value of hand-me-downs," Myra declared loudly. "We wouldn't want you growing up with a sense of entitlement, dear. Humility starts young." The silence that followed was suffocating. I felt the heat rising in my neck, a volcanic pressure threatening to erupt. Sable looked away, pretending to be fascinated by her necklace, while Avon let out a short, sharp laugh. Alara looked at the bag, then up at me, her eyes filled with a confusion that broke my heart. I knelt beside her, ignoring the burning stares of my parents. I reached out and took the bag, placing it gently on the floor. "The value of a gift isn't in its price tag, Alara," I said softly, my voice steady enough to cut through the tension. "It's found in the heart of the one who gives it. We will accept this with grace, because our worth isn't kept in a plastic bag. It stays right here, in who we are." I looked Myra directly in the eyes. I didn't see a mother. I saw a woman who was bankrupt in every way that mattered. You can't make someone feel small if they know they are the only giant in the room. We stood up, Alara's hand tucked firmly in mine. As the dinner bell tolled, a somber metallic sound that signaled the beginning of the end, Avon cornered me near the dining room entrance. "The server audit, Cora," he hissed, his face inches from mine. "I saw you checking your phone. If those servers aren't optimized by dawn, I'll tell Father you're being uncooperative. He's already looking for a reason to put you back on the street." He was using my supposed poverty as a leash. They all were. They used financial dependency as a weapon because it was the only power they understood. I felt my smartwatch vibrate. A coded pulse. It was Vera. The foreclosure documents were officially in my company's name. The noose was ready. I leaned in toward my brother, my voice a whisper of pure, cold logic. "The greatest deception, Avon, is letting your enemy believe they've already won." I walked past him into the dining room, the smell of roasted turkey and old lies filling the air. As I sat down at the far end of the table, Sable leaned over, her perfume cloying and sweet. "Don't get too comfortable, little sister," she whispered, her eyes dancing with a cruel light. "By this time tomorrow, Alara won't be your problem to worry about anymore. The lawyers have already seen your tax returns." My grip on the silver fork tightened until my knuckles turned white. I met her gaze with a fire I had spent years dampening. I thought of the Chicago blizzard outside. Cold, relentless, and unforgiving. That storm was nothing compared to what was coming for them. The air in the grand dining hall was thick enough to choke on. Expensive pine needles and cinnamon candles fought for dominance, but beneath the festive scents lay the cold, metallic tang of judgment. My family sat around the mahogany table like statues of high society perfection, their silverware clinking against fine china with the rhythmic precision of a ticking clock. Every sharp sound felt like a needle pricking my skin. Lyle stood at the head of the table, his wine glass raised. The candlelight caught the silver in his hair, casting long, skeletal shadows against the wallpaper. "A toast," he announced, his voice booming with an authority that didn't reach his eyes. "To heritage, to the Andrews legacy, and to the perfection we maintain, even when tested by those who fail to meet our standards." He didn't look at me. He didn't look at Alara. His gaze drifted right over us as if we were empty space. Myra sat opposite him, her posture as straight as a blade. She didn't offer a chair. Instead, she gestured toward the sideboard. "Cora, since the staff is busy with the main course, you can handle the soup. It's the least you can do to contribute." I didn't argue. Argument is a currency my family uses to buy more of your soul. I moved to the sideboard, the heavy porcelain tureen of hot lobster bisque radiating a heat that mirrored the pressure building behind my ribs. Alara sat at a small side table, her eyes wide and fearful, watching me. I felt the weight of her gaze, her silent plea for safety. As I began to serve, I felt Sable's eyes on me. She was smirking, her fingers playing with the stem of her crystal flute. I approached the table with the first bowl. Just as I reached the gap between Sable and Avon, Sable's silk-clad legs shot out from beneath the white Belgian lace. I tripped. The heavy tureen tilted dangerously in my arms, the scalding liquid sloshing toward the rim. My heart leaped into my throat. With a surge of athletic instinct I'd honed through years of carrying Alara, I twisted my torso, absorbing the momentum into my hips. I stabilized. Not a single drop touched the floor. Laughter erupted. Not the warm, belly-deep laughter of a family at Christmas, but a sharp, jagged braying. Avon chuckled into his napkin. Sable didn't even try to hide her delight. "Clumsy as always, Cora," she remarked, her voice dripping with artificial pity. "Perhaps those tech support hands aren't meant for fine porcelain." I stood there, the heat of the soup seeping through the porcelain into my palms. My face was a mask of unyielding stone. A stumble is not a fall as long as you carry your truth upright. I refused to give them the satisfaction of a tear. I refused to let them see me break. I caught Alara's terrified eyes and gave her a slow, secret wink. I saw her shoulders drop, a tiny breath of relief escaping her lips. I realized then that my family's wealth had only made their hearts more brittle, while mine had become iron. "The wine, Cora," Myra commanded, her voice cutting through the laughter. "Avon's glass is empty." I moved to retrieve the bottle. As I reached across the table, Sable leaned in, her movements deceptively helpful. "Here, let me," she whispered. She grabbed the base of the bottle, but instead of taking it, she gave it a sharp, calculated jerk. The wine didn't just spill, it erupted. A deep crimson wave of Cabernet crashed across my lap, soaking through my sweater and trousers. But worse, it splashed across the center of the table, a dark, jagged stain spreading over Myra's pristine heirloom lace. The room went deathly silent. Myra stood so abruptly her chair screeched against the hardwood like a dying animal. She didn't look at the stain. She didn't look at Sable. She looked at me with a venom so pure it seemed to vibrate in the candlelight. Before I could breathe, her hand blurred through the air. The slap was sharp. It echoed off the high ceilings, a sound more visceral than any scream. I felt the sting ignite on my cheek, the heat blooming instantly. The servants froze in the doorway. Alara let out a small, choked gasp. "You are a filthy animal!" Myra screamed, her face contorted into a mask I didn't recognize. "A filthy animal! You bring the stench of the streets into my home and ruin everything you touch! Look at this! This lace was my mother's!" I didn't flinch. I didn't raise a hand to my face. I stood there, feeling the cold wine soak into my skin, the sting on my cheek a badge of their failure, not mine. I remembered a truth I'd read long ago. No one can make you feel inferior without your consent. I looked at my mother and felt nothing but a profound, hollow sadness. I finally saw the monster behind the manicured facade. Clean it up, Lyle growled. He didn't look at Myra. He didn't scold her for the violence. He looked at me as if I were a broken appliance. Then stand in the corner until you are told to leave. Avon, pass the steak. Avon continued eating, his knife scraping against the plate with a chilling indifference. I took a deep, steadying breath. The filthy animal Myra saw was the only person in this room with a conscience that wasn't rotting. Respect is earned, I told myself, but dignity is something you are born with and no one can take away. I felt a vibration in my apron pocket. It was a sharp, double pulse, the code from Vera. The moral turpitude clause in the Andrews Living Trust was now legally actionable. By striking me in front of witnesses, Myra hadn't just broken a family bond, she had triggered the very legal mechanism I needed to accelerate their eviction. Every slap, every insult was another nail in the coffin of their comfort. Lyle wiped his mouth with a napkin and stood up. His shadow loomed over the table, dark and oppressive. He didn't look at the wife who had just assaulted his daughter. He looked at the door. "I'm done with this charade," Lyle growled, his voice a jagged blade. "Lyle, get the bags. You're leaving, now." The heavy oak door didn't just close. It slammed with a finality that vibrated through the porch floorboards and into the soles of my feet. The metallic click of the deadbolt was a gunshot in the midnight air, signaling the end of my life as a daughter in this house. Lyle and Avon had moved with a practiced, coordinated cruelty, grabbing our worn duffel bags and hurling them into the darkness. The cheap fabric hit the deep Evanston snow with a soft, hollow thud, disappearing instantly into the white abyss. Lyle's face was a distorted mask of aristocratic rage, his breath billowing like dragon smoke in the sub-zero air. "Get out, you piece of trash!" he yelled, his voice trembling with the hatred I'd tried to hide my whole life. "Get out and take your mistake with you!" Myra stood just inside the foyer, her silhouette framed by the warm, golden light of the chandelier. She didn't reach out. She didn't cry. Her only concern was the draft, her hand already pulling the door shut to protect her perfect sanctuary from the filth of the outside world. Beside her, Sable wore a smug, victorious smile, the look of a woman who had finally pruned a dead branch from the family tree. I stood on the porch for 3 agonizing seconds, my body angled to shield 5-year-old Alara from the biting Chicago wind. I didn't beg. I didn't scream. I simply remembered a stoic truth. A house built on such profound cruelty could never truly be a home. The people who think they are locking you out are often the ones locking themselves in a prison of their own making. "Mommy, it's cold," Alara whispered, her voice trembling so violently it shook my entire frame. "Don't look back, sweetheart," I murmured into the crown of her head, my voice a low, steady anchor. "The stars are brightest when the world is darkest. Keep your eyes on the road." I stepped off the porch and into the waist-deep snow to retrieve our bags. My fingers were already losing sensation, but I felt a terrifying, quiet dignity rising within me. I wasn't losing a family. I was finally shedding a burden that had been crushing my soul for 30 years. The walk down the long, winding driveway felt like a journey through an Arctic wasteland. The blizzard was a blinding wall of white, erasing the boundaries between the ground and the sky. This was Chicago in late December, a lethal -15 degrees Celsius. Every breath we took felt like swallowing needles, the moisture freezing on our eyelashes. I knew with a chilling clarity that if I were truly the penniless freelancer my family believed me to be, this walk would be a death sentence for my daughter. My father hadn't just evicted us, he had attempted to erase us. I stopped in the middle of the driveway, the wind howling through the skeletal trees. I pulled off my heavy wool coat and wrapped it tightly around Alara, ignoring the immediate, bone-deep sting of the cold hitting my thin sweater. I became a statue of maternal iron, my gaze fixed on the distant, blurry glow of streetlights at the edge of the property. I realized then that they didn't just want us gone, they wanted us destroyed. Kindness is not a weakness, and my silence was never permission. Tonight, I was done being the daughter who endured. I was becoming the consequence they never saw coming. As we reached the corner of the estate's property line, the blizzard seemed to intensify, threatening to swallow our small silhouettes whole. Then, a pair of powerful LED headlights cut through the white curtain. A massive black Cadillac Escalade pulled silently to the curb, its tires crunching on the fresh ice. The driver began to step out to assist with the bags, but I waved him back. I moved with a singular, cold focus, ushering Alara into the leather-scented warmth of the heated cabin. The transition was instantaneous. The roar of the wind was replaced by the low, expensive hum of the climate control. I sat in the plush seat, my body shivering as the blood began to flow back into my extremities. But my mind was already miles away. I pulled a secure, encrypted laptop from the hidden compartment in the armrest. The IT support persona I had worn as a mask was dead, buried under the snow on my father's lawn. I looked at my reflection in the darkened window. The red mark from Myra's slap was still visible on my pale cheek, a physical receipt of their debt. I opened a direct, encrypted line to Vera. "Vera," I said, my voice as steady and sharp as a scalpel. "The experiment is over. They chose the bricks and mortar over their own flesh and blood. Now, I want them to lose both. Execute the kill switch on the Andrews Heritage Trust and the Evanston mortgage immediately." Vera's voice was crisp and professional on the other end. "Confirmed, Cora. Since Lyle breached the moral turpitude clause of the private lending agreement by endangering a minor in a life-threatening weather event, the 24-hour immediate eviction protocol is legally ironclad. The papers are being processed through the Cook County electronic filing system as we speak." I looked at the digital clock on the dashboard. 11:59 p.m. The last minute of Christmas Eve was ticking away. I watched the distant, flickering lights of the mansion in the rearview mirror. A house of cards built on my hidden labor and my silent endurance. I whispered to the frosted glass, "You have exactly 24 hours to enjoy my hospitality, Father. Make every second count, because tomorrow, the bill for 30 years of cruelty finally comes due." The morning of December 26th broke over Chicago with a deceptive, blinding brilliance. The blizzard had finally exhausted itself, leaving behind a world draped in a thick, suffocating blanket of white. From my corner office on the 42nd floor of the Calyx Properties headquarters, the city looked like an architect's model, clean, silent, and entirely under my control. The sterile glass walls reflected a woman who bore little resemblance to the IT grunt my family had humiliated less than 2 days ago. I adjusted my charcoal blazer, feeling the cool silk against my skin. The slap mark on my cheek had faded to a faint, yellowish bruise, but the memory of it remained as sharp as a diamond. I sat at my desk, the rhythmic tapping of my fingers against the mahogany surface mimicking the ticking of a clock. On the large monitor to my left, a remote security feed from the Evanston estate played in high definition. It was a macabre theater. Lyle and Avon were in the library, the very room where I had signed away my inheritance. They were pouring heavy measures of scotch at 8 a.m., their faces flushed with a manic, drunken joy. I watched as Lyle waved a phone in the air, his chest puffed out like a peacock. "A miracle, Avon," Lyle's voice crackled through the hidden speakers. "An all-cash offer, no contingencies. We close in 48 hours. The trash cleared itself out just in time for us to wash our hands of this place and start fresh." Avon let out a jagged laugh, leaning back in the chair I had paid for. "I told you, Dad. Cora was the bad luck charm. Once she's gone, the money flows. We'll be back on top before the new year." In the parlor, Myra was already moving with predatory efficiency. She was walking from room to room with a digital tablet, cataloging the French antiques and the Persian rugs. She spoke into a headset, likely coordinating with movers for her new luxury condo in the city. They were celebrating a windfall that didn't exist. They were selling a house they no longer legally controlled to a buyer who was currently watching them through a lens. I felt no joy in their delusional triumph, only a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. Greed is a bottomless pit that exhausts the soul in an endless effort to satisfy a hunger that cannot be fed. Looking at them, I understood that they weren't just my parents. They were addicts of status, and I was finally cutting off the supply. I stood up and walked to the office lounge, where Alara was sitting by the floor-to-ceiling window, coloring a picture of a sun-drenched beach. She looked up and smiled, her eyes clear and untroubled by the storms of the last few days. I sat beside her and stroked her hair. "Mommy, are we going back to the big cold house?" she asked, her voice small. "No, sweetheart," I said, my voice a low, steady anchor. We are never going back there. We're building a new life where the sun is always out, and where no one can tell us we don't belong at the table." I watched her for a moment, realizing that real wealth isn't the millions in my accounts or the skyscrapers I own. Real wealth is the person you refuse to become when the world tries to break you. I had survived their fire, and I had emerged not as ash, but as steel. The peaceful moment was shattered by a sharp chime from my desk. I returned to the monitors to find a high-priority alert from my personal banking representative. Lyle, it seemed, was playing his last card. Using the lingering threads of his influence as a former banking executive, he had contacted an old protege at my local branch. He had flagged my freelance account, the one I used for groceries and gas to maintain my cover, as a vehicle for familial financial elder abuse. He claimed I had siphoned the funds from the Andrews estate. Within seconds, the screen showed my account status. Frozen pending investigation. I sat back, a cold smile touching my lips. This was their peak countermove. Lyle intended to leave me penniless in the middle of a Chicago winter, a tactic designed to force me to crawl back on my knees and beg for mercy. He wanted to use my poverty as a weapon in his plan to take Alara. But the account he froze was a decoy. A tactical tether I had kept specifically so they would feel powerful enough to overreach. By attacking it, Lyle hadn't hurt me. He had legally documented his own malice and intent for the Illinois courts. When a tiger is cornered, he doesn't roar out of fear. He roars to signal the end of the hunt. My father had just handed me the final piece of evidence I needed to prove a pattern of harassment. "Vera, are you seeing this?" I asked, clicking the intercom. "I am, Cora." Vera's voice came through, sharp and professional. "He just committed a felony by using false pretenses to interfere with your private assets. It's the final nail." Vera walked into my office a few minutes later, her arms full of folders. The sun reflecting off the Chicago skyline made the glass room feel like a cathedral of glass and light. We began the 24-hour pivot. Vera warned that the asset freeze might complicate the sheriff's arrival, but I had already shifted our legal footing. We weren't just executing an eviction for non-payment. We were filing for an immediate breach of trust based on criminal harassment and the endangerment of a minor. The Andrews Heritage Trust was a legal masterpiece I had constructed years ago. It was the invisible hand that paid their property taxes, their utilities, and Myra's club fees. But the contract was clear. The support was contingent on the peaceful and respectful cohabitation of all heirs. By striking me, by throwing a child into a blizzard, and now by attacking my finances, Lyle had technically defaulted on the very agreement that kept the lights on in Evanston. The law is a cold, unfeeling machine, and I was the only one in the room who knew how to operate the gears. "I want to move the schedule up," I told Vera, looking at the digital clock on the wall. "I want them to feel the full weight of that 24-hour mark. I want them to be in the middle of their victory dinner when the reality hits." I thought of the lesson I had learned the hard way. The best revenge isn't to be louder or crueler than your enemy. The best revenge is to be entirely unlike the person who hurt you. I wouldn't use my fists, and I wouldn't use their slurs. I would use the truth, and the truth would be the most devastating weapon of all. I stood up and adjusted my blazer, feeling a strange, quiet calm settle over me. It had been exactly 22 hours since I had been pushed out into the snow. The countdown was almost over. I looked at Vera and nodded toward the door. "Call the sheriff's department," I said, my voice dropping to a whisper of pure, cold logic. "I want the escort ready at the gates by sundown. The Andrews family has enjoyed my hospitality for far too long. It's time to close the books." I walked to the window and watched the sun begin its slow descent toward the horizon. It cast long, blood-red shadows over the city, reaching out toward the suburbs like a final warning. While Lyle was downstairs in Evanston, signing what he believed was $1 million contract, the first Cook County cruisers were already beginning their silent approach. The bill for 30 years of coldness was about to be delivered, and I was the one who would ensure it was paid in full. Exactly 24 hours after Cora was thrown into the blizzard, the driveway of the Andrews estate was illuminated by the rhythmic, pulsing glare of Cook County Sheriff's vehicles. The blue and red lights cut through the chilling dusk, reflecting off the snow like a neon warning. Inside, the deceptive warmth of the mansion still held. Lyle, Avon, and Myra were in the middle of a celebratory toast, glasses of vintage champagne raised high. They were laughing about their impending million-dollar sale, convinced they had finally pruned the trash from their lives when the doorbell rang with a heavy, official thud. Vera stepped into the foyer with the practiced composure of a woman who held all the high cards. She was accompanied by 2 uniformed officers and a professional locksmith. Lyle's face shifted from drunken joy to aristocratic outrage in a heartbeat. He tried to use his old high society charm, pulling his silk robe tighter around him as if it were armor. "What is the meaning of this intrusion?" Lyle demanded, his voice trembling with a desperate authority. "My daughter, Cora, is behind this, isn't she? This is harassment. Officers, I am a former banking executive and I demand you remove these people immediately." Vera didn't flinch. She simply pulled a document from her leather briefcase. "Mr. Andrews, I am here as the legal representative for Calyx Properties. This is an eviction notice for immediate breach of trust. You have exactly 20 minutes to vacate the premises." Lyle let out a hollow laugh, his hand shaking. "I don't know what games Cora is playing, but I am in the middle of a legal sale. This house is mine." "No, Lyle," Vera replied, her voice dropping into a sharp, clinical register. "Your attempt to freeze Cora's accounts yesterday triggered an automatic hostile intent clause in your private mortgage agreement. Under Illinois law, Cora is the sole owner of the entity that holds your debt. You have been a guest on her sufferance, and that sufferance has officially expired." Vera tapped a button on her phone, and Cora's voice filled the foyer through the speaker. It was a calm, resonant sound that felt heavier than the silence. "Family is a sanctuary, Father, not a prison. When you cast me and Alara into the storm, you forfeited your right to the warmth I provided. Justice isn't the presence of punishment. It's the restoration of balance." The atmosphere shifted instantly. Realizing their empire of cards was collapsing, Avon's face went pale. He didn't look at his father. He turned and sprinted toward the upstairs study, his footsteps thundering on the grand staircase. He believed that if he could just destroy the forged financial records and debt documents he'd used to siphon money from the estate, Cora would have no proof. Downstairs, Sable underwent a sudden, dramatic transformation. She dropped to her knees, her designer dress pooling in the dust, and grabbed the hem of Vera's coat. "Please," she sobbed, her voice a shrill, manufactured plea for mercy. "We didn't mean it. We were just stressed. Tell Cora we're sorry. Please, Vera, have some heart." It was a textbook manipulative performance, a desperate attempt to strike at the compassion they still believed Cora possessed. Vera looked down at her with a profound, cold indifference. "Sable, the time for performance ended when the door locked last night." The officers intervened quickly. One moved upstairs, blocking the study door before Avon could reach the shredder. "Mr. Andrews, stop where you are," the officer commanded. "This mansion is now a secured scene for a financial fraud investigation. Everything inside is a fixed asset." The locksmith began his work, the metallic grinding of the drill echoing through the foyer as he changed the codes on the biometric safes Lyle thought only he could access. I watched this chaos through the officer's body cam feed, back in my office. I didn't feel a single spark of joy at their panic. Instead, I felt a deep, cleansing relief. The lies were over. Truth doesn't cost anything, but a lie will eventually cost you everything you have. Under the sheriff's supervision, the family was given 20 minutes to gather only essential personal belongings. I watched as Myra tried to wrap the Belgian lace tablecloth around her arm, only to have an officer firmly pull it away. "This stays, ma'am. It's part of the property." Lyle, Avon, and Myra were led to the front door, the same door they had slammed in my face 24 hours ago. My security team had already blocked the luxury cars in the driveway. Since those vehicles were purchased through a credit line tied to the shell company, they were repossessed on the spot. They were forced to walk out onto the porch in their house shoes and robes, their eyes stunned and hollow as they looked out at the freezing Chicago night. I spoke one last time through the speaker, my voice a quiet vow to the wind. "I am not doing this to hurt you. I am doing this to stop you from ever hurting Alara again. May the Chicago wind help you find the humility that wealth hid from you for 30 years. The door closed. The heavy deadbolt clicked into place, locked from the inside by my people. Lyle stood on the sidewalk, shivering in his silk robe, staring at the darkened windows of the house he once thought was his kingdom. Then, The massive 70-inch smart TV in the parlor suddenly flickered to life, its glow visible through the grand bay window. The harsh glare of the mansion's security floodlights bounced off the fresh Evanston snow, creating a cold, blue radiance that felt more like a crime scene than a holiday home. I watched from the shadows of the gated entrance as my family stood huddled on the lawn, their silk robes and thin slippers soaking through. They looked small. For 30 years they had been giants in my mind, but tonight, stripped of the walls they used as armor, they were just shivering strangers. Suddenly, the massive smart TV in the grand parlor flickered to life, its brilliant glow cutting through the dark bay window like a beacon of truth. I appeared on that screen, my silhouette framed by the amber glow of the Chicago Gold Coast skyline. I didn't look like the filthy animal Myra had slapped, nor the trash Lyle had discarded. I was Cora Andrews, the CEO of Calyx Properties, and for the first time, I was the one holding the floor. I watched Lyle's face through the security camera as he stared at my image. He looked like a man watching his own execution. "I think it's time for an honest accounting," I said, my voice projecting through the exterior speakers with a calm, terrifying clarity. "Every mortgage payment made on this house for the last 36 months, every luxury tax, and even the heating oil keeping you warm tonight, it didn't come from a family trust. It came from me. Andrews Heritage Holdings wasn't your legacy, Lyle. It was my personal charity to a family that never once offered me a seat at the table without a price tag." Lyle collapsed onto a snow-covered stone bench, the realization hitting him with the force of a physical blow. The daughter he had disowned was the only reason he hadn't been in the gutter years ago. Beside him, Sable and Avon stood in a hollow, haunting silence. They realized that their miracle sale was a ghost, a trap set by the very sister they had spent a lifetime bullying. "You called me a filthy animal for spilling wine," I continued, my voice steady. "Yet you drank the wine my sweat provided. You threw me out into a lethal storm, forgetting that I was the one who built the roof over your heads. I'm not here for revenge. I'm here because I'm finished being your secret." Vera stepped forward, her heels crunching on the ice as she handed the final stack of documents to the sheriff. Under Illinois law, the harassment and endangerment Lyle committed when he threw a 5-year-old into a blizzard had voided any right to cure the default. They were legally homeless, their credit lines severed, their masks finally shattered. I addressed them one last time, feeling a weary, profound wisdom settle over me. The most powerful thing you can do to someone who treats you like nothing is to show them you are everything without them. "I won't leave you in the snow," I said, a flicker of that old Andrews compassion being the final word. "I have prepaid for 1 week at a motel down the road, not for your sake, but for mine. I refuse to let my heart become as cold as yours. I am still a daughter, Lyle, but I am no longer your victim." The scene shifted. The noise of their frantic excuses and Myra's shrill protests faded into the hum of the city. I was in my own home now, a sanctuary of glass and light overlooking Lake Michigan. The scent of lavender replaced the smell of old mahogany. I walked into the bedroom and tucked the covers around Alara, watching the rhythmic rise and fall of her chest. Here, there was no judgment. There was only peace. I stood by the window as the first light of dawn began to bleed over the horizon, turning the lake into a sheet of hammered silver. I remembered a philosophy I'd lived by. The best revenge is to be entirely unlike the person who performed the injury. I felt the weight of 30 years of seeking their approval finally lift, evaporating like the morning mist. My success wasn't the empire I'd built. It was the courage to walk away into that blizzard and know I was enough. I looked at a small framed photo on my desk, me at 5 years old, standing alone in the backyard of the Evanston house. I ran my thumb over the glass and whispered, "We're okay now." I picked up my tablet, opened the contact list, and with a single steady swipe, deleted the Andrews family group. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't seeking an apology. I was simply finished. As the Chicago sun rose, it didn't just light up the room. It illuminated a woman who didn't just survive the storm. She became the master of it.